The medieval world was a place where justice was often brutal, unfair, and terrifying. From bizarre trials to horrifying executions, the punishments of the time reflected a society that believed suffering could reveal the truth. If someone was accused of a crime, they didn't get a fair trial. Instead, they faced trial by ordeal. This could mean holding a red-hot iron, walking across burning coals, or being thrown into a freezing river. If they survived or healed quickly, it meant God had judged them innocent. If not, their guilt was proven, and they were punished, often by execution. For lesser crimes, people were put in stocks or pillories, wooden frames that locked their heads and hands in place in the town square. There they were pelted with rotten food, mud, and even stones by angry crowds. This punishment wasn't just about suffering, it was meant to shame criminals so they wouldn't repeat their offences. Anyone suspected of witchcraft faced torture, forced confessions, and execution. Many were burned at the stake or hanged. Some trials used the ordeal by water, where the accused was thrown into a river. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent. Either way, survival was unlikely. Believe it or not, animals could be charged with crimes like destroying crops, attacking people, or even stealing. There are records of pigs being executed, goats being put on trial, and even insects being sentenced for damaging harvests. These trials were taken just as seriously as human cases. While peasants were punished for the smallest crimes, nobles often had private armies and could ignore the king's laws. They settled disputes with bribery, duels, or outright violence. If a noble did commit a crime, they were more likely to be banished or fined rather than executed. Poisoning was a serious fear, especially among the wealthy. To protect themselves, kings and nobles hired food testers, people who took the first bite of a meal to make sure it wasn't poisoned. If the tester survived, the food was considered safe. If not, well, it was time to find a new tester. Instead of going to court, people could fight to prove their innocence. Trial by combat was a legal way to settle accusations. Whoever won was considered right in the eyes of the law. Even minor disputes could be settled with swords, and sometimes the fight was to the death. Stealing wasn't taken lightly in the medieval world. Even petty theft, like stealing a loaf of bread, could lead to a harsh punishment, including hanging. The idea was that harsh penalties would scare people into obedience, but it often meant poor people faced death for minor crimes. Making fake coins was one of the worst crimes a person could commit. Since money was directly tied to the king's power, counterfeiting was seen as an act of treason. The punishment? Being thrown into a cauldron of boiling water or oil. Some trials were based entirely on pain and survival. In ordeal by fire, the accused had to carry a burning hot object. If their wounds healed, they were innocent. In ordeal by water, the accused was tied up and tossed into a river. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank, they were innocent, but often drowned. Grab your sword, strap on your armour, and let's ride into battle. Think castles were just grand stone homes. Think again. Defending a castle was brutal, and one of the sneakiest defences was murder holes. These were gaps in the ceiling where defenders could dump boiling oil, molten lead, or even rocks on invaders trying to storm the gates. If you ever wanted to take a swim in a medieval moat, don't. Most castle toilets, called garderobes, were simple stone seats with holes, leading directly into the moat. Yep, the same water that protected the castle from enemies was also filled with human waste. So if you were a soldier sieging a castle, not only were you dodging arrows, but you were also standing next to a giant medieval toilet. Becoming a knight wasn't just about wearing cool armour and swinging swords. It took a lifetime of training. Boys as young as 7 years old became pages, working under knights and learning basic combat skills. By 14, they became squires, training harder, polishing armour, and assisting in real battles. If they survived all that, they were knighted around age 21. No participation trophies here. If you couldn't keep up, you were out. Ever heard the myth that knights in full armour couldn't move? That's completely false. A full suit of plate armour weighed 80 to 100 pounds, but it was so well designed that knights could run, climb, and even do somersaults in it. Some knights even wrestled and fought on foot in full armour, proving that they weren't just walking tin cans. Jousting wasn't just a sport, it was a death match on horseback. Two knights charged at full speed, aiming their lances to shatter on impact. Even though they used blunt lances, knights often died from broken necks, concussions, or even splinters piercing their eyes. In one famous case, King Henry II of France was killed in a joust when a lance splintered through his eye socket. Talk about a painful way to go. The longbow was one of the deadliest weapons of the Middle Ages. Unlike short bows, these could pierce knight armour from over 200 yards away. At the Battle of Agincourt, 1415, English longbowmen decimated the French knights, proving that you didn't need heavy armour to win battles. You just needed a really, really big bow. Castles were built for defence, but if things got too dangerous, lords had hidden tunnels to escape a siege. These tunnels, called sally ports, led to secret exits beyond the castle walls, allowing defenders to sneak out, surprise the enemy, or even escape unnoticed. So if you ever feel trapped, just remember, medieval lords had a backup plan. Not all knights served kings, some joined mysterious warrior orders. The Knights Templar, Teutonic Knights, and Hospitallers were elite warriors sworn to protect pilgrims and fight in holy wars. Many of these knights became legendary, with some believing they guarded sacred relics like the Holy Grail. Their secrets remain shrouded in mystery, with some even inspiring legends of hidden treasure. Forget soccer or basketball. If you were a noble in medieval times, your favourite sport was hunting with falcons. Falconry was a status symbol, with trained birds hunting rabbits, pheasants, and even small deer. Only the wealthiest nobles could afford rare falcons from the Middle East, making them a prized possession in medieval courts. Think of it as having a luxury sports car, except it's a bird. Dogs and horses were common nightly pets, but some took it to the next level. They kept bears as pets. Knights returning from wars sometimes brought back exotic animals. Some even trained bears for hunting, or had them fight in tournaments for entertainment. Imagine riding into battle with a trained war bear. Now that's medieval madness. Medicine in the Middle Ages was questionable at best. If you were sick, your chances of survival depended more on luck than actual science. Let's take a look at some of the wildest medical practices and superstitions of medieval times. Feeling sick? Just drain some blood. Bloodletting was one of the most common treatments for everything. Fevers, headaches, infections, you name it. The idea was that illnesses were caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids, so removing blood would rebalance the body. Problem was, it often made people weaker, or even killed them. Believe it or not, medieval doctors tasted urine to diagnose illnesses. They believed the colour, smell, and taste revealed a patient's condition. Imagine walking into a doctor's office today and being handed a cup of pee for a taste test. Yeah, hard pass. The Black Death was the deadliest pandemic in history, wiping out nearly 50% of Europe's population in just a few years. But what caused it? Some believed it was bad air, others blamed angry gods or even witchcraft. People carried flowers or burned herbs to purify the air, none of which helped, of course. These guys, they weren't just creepy, they believed their beaked masks, stuffed with herbs, would protect them from the deadly disease. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Ever had a headache so bad you'd drill a hole in your head? Well, medieval doctors did just that. This practice, called trepanning, was meant to release evil spirits causing mental illness, seizures, or migraines, and somehow, people survived this. Before modern medicine, many treatments were a mix of herbs, magic spells, and crushed gemstones. Yup, some believed powdered gems could cure disease, while others relied on charms and prayers to heal. Let's just say medical school wasn't really a thing back then. Forget modern hospitals. Medieval ones were more like shelters run by monks. They provided food and a place to rest. But actual medical care? Not so much. If you got better, great. If not, well, prayers were your best hope. Believe it or not, people thought that kings had healing powers. It was called the king's touch, and rulers were believed to cure diseases like scrofula just by laying their hands on the sick. Did it work? Probably not. But hey, it gave people hope. Of all the bizarre treatments, leeches are still used today. In medieval times, they were placed on wounds to suck out bad blood and prevent infection. Turns out modern doctors actually use leeches in surgery to improve circulation, one of the few medieval treatments that wasn't complete nonsense. Giving birth in medieval times was dangerous, so midwives relied on prayers, amulets, and herbal remedies to protect mothers and babies. Superstition and medicine often went hand in hand, because back then, any bit of luck was needed to survive. Welcome to a world long past but still brimming with life and stories. The medieval tavern. Imagine stepping into a space where the warm glow of candlelight reflects off wooden beams. The air is rich with the aroma of roasted meats and ale, and the room hums with laughter, conversation, and the occasional burst of a bard's tune. So grab a seat by the fire, raise a tankard, and join us as we step into the lively world of the medieval tavern. Taverns were far more than just places to eat and drink. They were essential stops for weary travellers, offering shelter, a warm meal, and a safe place to rest for the night. For merchants on long journeys, they provided opportunities to network, trade goods, and share news from distant lands. There were different types of taverns catering to various needs. The most common were ale houses, humble establishments frequented by peasants and labourers. Here, the focus was simple: a hearty drink and basic food to keep you going. Inns, on the other hand, offered more amenities, including lodging for travellers who needed a place to stay overnight. For the wealthy and noble class, high-end establishments provided finer accommodations, often with imported wines and exotic foods to suit their refined tastes. Taverns weren't just for individuals passing through. They often acted as informal community centres. Locals would gather to discuss village matters, celebrate special occasions, or even hold town meetings. In some cases, taverns doubled as courtrooms, where disputes were settled over a mug of ale. Tavern signs played a crucial role in medieval towns. Since many people couldn't read, these signs used symbols to represent the establishment. A red lion, a swan, or a cluster of grapes would signify a place to stop for a drink. They also helped travellers find their way in an unfamiliar town. Food and drink were the cornerstone of any good tavern experience, and the menu was as diverse as the patrons themselves. The staple dish of the time was pottage, a thick, hearty stew made from vegetables, grains, and sometimes meat if you could afford it. For those who preferred something simpler, trenchers were a common choice. These were slices of stale bread used as makeshift plates, absorbing the juices of whatever meal was served on them. Bread was a constant on the table, though it was often coarse and made from barley or rye. It was frequently paired with cheese or preserved meats, staples that could be stored and eaten throughout the year. Wealthier patrons, however, enjoyed more luxurious fare, such as roasted meats seasoned with exotic spices like cinnamon or cloves, a sign of wealth and status. And of course, no tavern visit was complete without a drink. Ale and beer were by far the most popular choices, brewed locally and often by women known as alewives. Ale was a safer alternative to water, as the brewing process involved boiling, which killed harmful bacteria. Mead, made from fermented honey, was another favourite, along with cider and wine, depending on the region and the tavern's clientele. In medieval times, drinking was more than just quenching thirst. It was a communal activity. Sharing a drink was a way to build trust and camaraderie, and toasts were often made to health, prosperity, or safe travels. It was also about entertainment. Taverns were places where people could unwind, have fun, and sometimes even try their luck. Dice games like Hazard were extremely popular. A simple roll of the dice could determine the winner of a bet, and with gambling being widespread, the stakes often ran high. Board games like Nine Men's Morris, a strategy game similar to modern checkers, were also common and brought patrons together in friendly competition. For those who preferred physical challenges, outdoor games like archery contests or throwing competitions offered entertainment and a chance to show off their skills. These events often drew crowds, creating a festive atmosphere. Performances were another highlight of tavern life. Minstrels and bards entertained patrons with songs, tales of heroism, and even the latest news from afar. Occasionally, travelling actors or jesters would stop by to perform comedic skits, adding humour to the evening's revelry. Gambling was a common pastime, whether on games, contests, or even on each other's skills. But to ensure fairness, some taverns implemented their own house rules, a set of guidelines that kept disputes to a minimum and the games running smoothly. Entertainment and games were the heartbeat of a medieval tavern, bringing people together and creating memories that would be shared for years to come. Justice in the Middle Ages was both brutal and unforgiving. Theft could lead to hanging, even for something as small as a loaf of bread. If you were accused of a crime, you might face trial by ordeal, where guilt or innocence was determined by divine intervention. For example, suspects might be forced to carry a red-hot iron in their hands and walk 3 meters. If the wound healed cleanly within 3 days, they were innocent. If not, you'd already be condemned. For lesser crimes, public humiliation was the order of the day. Stocks and pillories were commonplace, and villagers were encouraged to throw rotten food, or worse, at the accused. Prisons, when used, were horrifically unsanitary, often becoming a death sentence in themselves due to disease and neglect. The concept of mercy was virtually non-existent, and the punishments meted out served as gruesome deterrents for would-be offenders. If you weren't born into wealth, your life was one of endless toil and hardship. Most peasants were serfs, legally bound to the land and their lord. Your day began before sunrise and ended well after sunset, spent ploughing fields, harvesting crops, or tending livestock. In return, you kept just enough to survive, with much of your yield going to the Lord and the church, as taxes or tithes. Even in good years, food was basic: coarse bread, watery pottage, and occasional vegetables. Meat was rare for the lower classes, as hunting was reserved for nobles. If crops failed, as they often did due to poor weather or pests, famine was inevitable. Malnutrition weakened entire communities, leaving them vulnerable to diseases, while back-breaking labour took a heavy toll on bodies. For women, life in the Middle Ages was doubly harsh. They were often viewed as morally weak and subservient to men, a perception deeply rooted in religious teachings of the time. Daily life revolved around relentless domestic chores: spinning, weaving, brewing ale, and managing the household. Rural women also toiled in the fields alongside men, while noble women oversaw estates but had little personal freedom. Marriage was rarely about love. Women were seen as property, exchanged in marriages to secure alliances or improve social standing. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death. Without pain relief or proper medical knowledge, complications often proved fatal for both mother and child. Midwives and herbal remedies were the only resources available, but they could do little against infections or difficult labours. The constant cycle of childbearing, illness and societal oppression left women with little reprieve from hardship. You would also notice that you wouldn't understand a single word. The common folk spoke Middle English, a dialect so foreign that it's nearly incomprehensible to modern ears. The elite communicated in French, and the clergy relied on Latin for prayers, documents, and sermons. These language barriers alone would make survival incredibly difficult. Even if you managed to communicate, literacy was a rare luxury. Only about 10% of men and 1% of women could read or write. Books were hand-copied, expensive treasures reserved for the wealthy or religious institutions. Most knowledge was passed down orally, creating an environment where misinformation and superstition flourished. Symbols and pictures helped bridge gaps, but they'd hardly prepare you for navigating this unfamiliar world. Childhood in the Middle Ages was a perilous journey fraught with danger. Nearly 1/3 of children didn't survive past the age of 5, falling victim to diseases like dysentery, measles, or whooping cough. The lack of medical knowledge, poor sanitation, and malnutrition only compounded the risks. Even in the womb, survival wasn't guaranteed. Poor diets during pregnancy led to complications, and women often consumed alcohol, unaware of its risks. For the lucky few who made it to adulthood, life was still harsh. The average life expectancy hovered around 30 to 40 years, though those who survived childhood illnesses and avoided war or famine could live longer. Still, the relentless hardships of the era ensured that few experienced a truly comfortable existence. Medieval Europe was rarely at peace. Wars between kingdoms and local lords were constant, and peasants were often conscripted to fight. Armed with little more than farm tools or crude weapons, they faced professional soldiers and brutal tactics. Casualties were high, and even if you survived the battlefield, the aftermath of war brought famine, disease, and economic ruin. The Crusades, the 100 Years' War, and countless smaller skirmishes claimed millions of lives. Villages were razed, livestock stolen, and fields burned, leaving entire communities destitute. The horrors of war weren't confined to the battlefield. Civilians often bore the brunt of the violence, living in perpetual fear of raids and invasions. Even the wealthy weren't immune to the dangers of medieval life. Fancy glazed pottery and leaded goblets were common at noble tables, but they often leached lead into food and drink. Chronic lead poisoning caused symptoms such as headaches, memory loss, and even death. Bread, a staple for rich and poor alike, sometimes carried ergot fungus, which caused ergotism. Symptoms included hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene. Outbreaks of ergotism could devastate entire villages and may have inspired tales of witchcraft or mass hysteria. The combination of poor hygiene, contaminated food, and toxic materials created an environment where health was constantly jeopardized. The Middle Ages were a far cry from the romanticized tales we imagine. Disease, famine, violence, and ignorance defined daily life, and even the wealthy faced dangers unimaginable today. While we admire the art, architecture, and traditions of the period, one thing is clear: surviving even a single day in the Dark Ages would be a monumental challenge. The year is 1347. A mysterious and deadly disease has swept across Europe. Known as the Black Death, this pandemic comprised 3 forms of plague: bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic. Together they ravaged the continent, reducing its population by as much as 50%. The question is, could you have survived? We'll explore the methods, some ingenious, others harsh, that might have kept you alive. Through these historical lessons, we uncover strategies for resilience that still hold relevance today. The pneumonic plague spread through airborne droplets, while the bubonic variety relied on fleas carried by rats. Urban centres, with their crowded streets, poor sanitation, and abundant rodent populations, became epicentres of the pandemic. To survive, the first rule was clear: stay away from the cities. Those who lived in rural areas or could escape to isolated villages significantly increased their chances of survival. Cities were hotbeds of infection, with dense populations exacerbating the rapid transmission of disease. For many, retreating to the countryside wasn't just an option, it was a necessity. Think of this as a medieval form of social distancing. Avoiding crowded markets, bustling taverns, and public festivals reduced exposure to infected individuals and flea-infested rodents. Isolation from these urban centres proved to be one of the most effective survival strategies. The practice of quarantine, a concept still used today, has its roots in the Black Death. In Venice, authorities required incoming ships to anchor offshore for 40 days, a practice known as 40 giorni, the origin of the word quarantine. This delay allowed time to identify and isolate potential carriers of the plague, reducing the risk of contagion. In Milan, officials took more extreme measures. Entire households displaying symptoms were sealed inside their homes. While this condemned many to die in isolation, it significantly lowered the city's mortality rate compared to other regions. These severe strategies demonstrate the lengths to which societies would go to curb the disease's spread. Contact with the deceased posed a significant risk. Corpses remained highly infectious, and the overwhelming number of deaths led to mass graves. In Florence, bodies were buried in layers with dirt between them, creating what one chronicler described as a human lasagna. Such practices underscore the desperation of the era. Specialized groups known as bechini were tasked with handling the dead. Their work was both essential and perilous, as many succumbed to the plague themselves. Some even turned to theft and violence, adding to the chaos. For the average person, avoiding contact with both the dead and those who managed them was a critical survival tactic. Fire served purposes beyond providing warmth. Pope Clement VI famously surrounded himself with a ring of flames, which likely kept infected individuals and disease-carrying fleas at bay. This unintentional method of disease prevention proved effective. Later, fire played a role in eradicating the plague from London. The Great Fire of 1666 destroyed much of the city's rat population, breaking the cycle of transmission. This historical example highlights how natural or deliberate actions can have unintended public health benefits. Plague doctors donned distinctive outfits, including bird-like masks filled with aromatic herbs. These masks were intended to filter miasma, or bad air, believed to carry the disease. Though scientifically inaccurate, the protective gear may have offered some defense against flea bites. The leather coats, gloves, and masks represented early attempts at personal protective equipment. While these measures were limited by the era's medical knowledge, they symbolized the ongoing effort to combat the plague. Good health was a valuable ally. Poor nutrition, unsanitary living conditions, and pre-existing illnesses heightened vulnerability to the plague. Acts like consuming fresh produce, maintaining personal hygiene, and staying active helped bolster natural defences. Though rooted more in practicality than science, these habits illustrate the connection between lifestyle and immunity. Even then, people understood the importance of physical well-being in the face of disease. Survival wasn't solely a matter of strategy. Genetic predispositions played a crucial role. Some individuals carried genetic traits that enhanced their resistance to Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague. Believing that foul air carried the disease, people burned incense and aromatic herbs to purify their surroundings. While ineffective against infection, these practices reflect early attempts to mitigate environmental risks and provide psychological comfort. The Black Death reshaped Europe and left a legacy of public health practices still relevant today. From quarantines to protective equipment, these historical strategies highlight humanity's ingenuity and resilience. Could you have survived, perhaps with a blend of preparation, adaptation, and luck? Most people in medieval times never travelled more than 10 miles from their birthplace. That's like spending your entire life in your hometown without ever leaving. Roads were dangerous, and most peasants were bound to the land, working for their lords from sunrise to sunset. Think your apartment needs a deep clean? Medieval homes had dirt floors, no glass windows, and were filled with the lovely aroma of smoke, sweat, and, well, livestock. Hygiene? That was a luxury few could afford. Toilets, forget about them. Most people simply had a hole in the ground or used chamber pots, which were dumped, sometimes out the window, onto the streets. Yep, medieval streets were not a place you'd want to take a casual stroll. Forget fancy silverware. Forks weren't commonly used in medieval Europe. People ate with their hands, knives, and sometimes spoons. If you dined with royalty, you might get a napkin. Otherwise, it was all about licking your fingers clean. Believe it or not, women were the primary brewers of beer. Since water was often unsafe to drink, beer was the go-to beverage for all ages. Brewing beer was a household task, just like cooking or baking bread. The medieval work week? 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset. Peasants worked long hours farming, tending livestock, and doing whatever their lord required. Sundays were a day of rest, and a much-needed break. Marriage in the Middle Ages happened early, sometimes as young as 12 for girls. Marriages were often arranged for economic or political reasons, not love. Romance novels had nothing on medieval reality. Think you can wear whatever you want, not in medieval times. Sumptuary laws dictated what colours and fabrics you could wear based on your social class. Peasants, earth tones, nobles, rich, vibrant hues. Medieval fairs were the highlight of the year. Think of them as a mix of a sports event, a music festival, and a wild party. Jousting, drinking, bear baiting, and live entertainment kept the crowds entertained. While peasants lived on bread and porridge, nobles feasted on extravagant dishes, swan, peacock, and even whale. Presentation was everything. Sometimes chefs would reassemble cooked birds with their feathers just for show,